What if I told you that the President of the United States is the military's commander-in-chief, but he does not have the right to declare war? The President can commit troops, but that's not necessarily a declaration of force. So what's the difference between committing troops and war, between conflict and force, and what exactly or where exactly are the lines drawn? Well, that's the job of the War Powers Act and the United States Constitution. And with recent events surrounding Venezuela and Greenland and the United States activity and proposed activity, the War Powers Act is back in the spotlight. So what is the War Powers Act? What does it do? And where are the limits for the president, Congress, and the United States military? Dr. Adam Carrington of Ashland University and the Ashbrook Center join us to talk about those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Not that long ago, the United States had begun certain operations in Venezuela. Originally, it was taking out some of their boats that the United States has suspected of bringing drugs into the United States. And then it was the capture of Venezuela President Maduro. This stirred a lot of conversations about what the limits of presidential authority and the United States military's authority are. The president then has talked about potentially using troops to seize Greenland in those ongoing conversations. And this has brought to forefront something called the War Powers Act. But what is the War Powers Act, and what are the president's rights and limits? What are the United States military's rights and limits? And what are Congress's rights and limits in all of this? We're joined by Dr. Adam Carrington. He's a constitutional scholar at Ashland University, where he's also co-director in the scholar program at the Ashbrook Center. Dr. Carrington, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me to talk about this important topic.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us. And let's just dive right into this. The Senate, a few weeks ago, tried to pass a version of the War Powers Act to reclaim their rights under it. It passed, and then two Republican senators flipped their votes later on, and it was blocked with Vice President Vance issuing the tie-breaking vote. But this brought to light this conversation of what is the War Powers Act? So let's start there. The War Powers Act is not a new thing in 2026. What is the War Powers Act?
Yes, it comes into existence in 1973 over the veto of then President Richard Nixon. So Congress overturns or overrides the veto. And it comes out of Congress's concern in particular about Nixon secretly okaying and then going through with bombing Cambodia during the Vietnam conflict without telling, much less getting Congress to approve the act. And in general, the worry from Korea to Vietnam of presidents unilaterally committing American troops to what become essentially warlike conflicts. So this was passed to attempt to, as you said, insert Congress back in. Congress trying to reclaim its powers, curtail the unilateral actions that presidents had been developing in what they believed they could do and what they tried to do. And so this set up a blueprint that still gave the president some leniency, and we can talk about maybe why they still did that, but that then set up a process where ultimately, for any at least long-term action, Congress was supposed to be okaying and approving these kind of actions. So it came out of that era, it came out of those concerns, and has been a point of debate and a point of assertion as well ever since.
So the Constitution grants the president the role of commander-in-chief. Why does the president not get to declare war then? We always understand that as Congress's role to declare war, but the president is the commander-in-chief. This is the separation of powers, but why separate that one out?
That's a great question, because historically, the executive and other forms of government in some ways had the power to do all of it, including declare war. But the separation of the declaration of war and the carrying out of war came from an understanding on two levels. One, Congress being given the power to declare war came out of the desire to deliberate, to have a group of people think hard about the commitment that could result in loss of life on a significant scale, loss of resources, damage of resources, and the president being alone isn't as conducive to deliberating. And also something that's closer to the people, with Congress having the will of the people across the country. But why then does the president retain the power to, as commander in chief, to wage war? So the difference is between declaring that it should exist and waging it. It's because the president, where he's not set up to be deliberative, because he's at the head of a branch, his unity, being the one president, sets him up to be energetic and decisive. And once the decision to make war has been determined by a deliberative body, the time for deliberation is no longer at hand. You need someone who can act decisively, quickly, seize the moment if the moment presents itself. The military historically has respected decisive unitary leaders over them, as opposed to congresses or in ancient Rome senates. So all of these things the framers of the Constitution thought of to say, in the particular facets of bringing us into war and then waging war, which branch, Congress or the presidency, is best able to do those particular acts, and has divided up the activities and duties along those lines.
Yeah, as Madison says in the Federalist Papers, that the power should be in our republic, power should be federalist in its scope, right, but unitary in its operation. And I'm just picturing Congress having the vote every time the U.S. military is going to move in an operation and the disaster that could be. So War Powers Act passed in 1973. So why is the Senate now again trying to move this legislation? What happened in those intervening years?
Well, what happens is that it is, and maybe a thing to mention is the criteria that get laid out. The president can commit troops unilaterally to some form of action within 48 hours. The president has to inform Congress of what he's did and what he was doing and why. And then he has a 60-day window to unilaterally keep troops doing whatever he's committed them to do within a optional 30 extra days to withdraw. But after that, Congress is supposed to approve, consent to, authorize any further continued action. And what's happened is presidents have sometimes followed this, and sometimes they haven't. And presidents all along have argued that this is unconstitutional, while Congress has declared what they're doing, the presidents are doing, is unconstitutional. So I think this is the idea that the war powers history has been not perfect in doing what the War Powers Act was intended to do. And there is some concern that if the president in the current situations has not gone beyond it, that he might do so, and wanting to get on record a further affirmation of the War Powers Act / maybe even some new limitations or more particular limitations on it.
And there have been instances where, correct me if I'm wrong, where Congress has almost punted on their responsibility. I think the Iraq War, where they didn't technically declare war, and yet they authorized the presidency to make those decisions, which seems to almost give up their own responsibility.
Yeah, or maybe I think your word about hedging, punting, maybe hedging might be a little better. But you're right that they've passed authorizations for the use of military force. That even happened in a limited way in Vietnam. It certainly happened in the lead up to Iraq, and it's above not doing anything or not saying anything, but it's below saying we actually are declaring war. The last time we actually did that in an official capacity was World War II, after Pearl Harbor. And you're right, it's a bit of Congress wanting to say something, but then being able to almost pull back and say, but we really didn't declare war. And you're right. There is no specific authorization in the Constitution to do something above nothing and below declaring war. So it is even questionable whether these are legitimate ways that Congress can speak, and it's certainly given presidents, in their own minds at least, much more leeway to then act, if not unilaterally, at least to take as much leash as Congress will give them, and they've tended to give them a lot of leash.
And that's true even away from the War Powers Act, right? Generally, presidents, you don't run for president because you want to give up power. Generally, presidents try to push their limits on how far they can go.
Absolutely. And that's the way that I think it's the way all branches were expected to work, Congress being a problem. But I think the executive, what's wonderful, one wonderful thing about those who framed the Constitution is they really thought about the psychology. They wouldn't have used that word, but the psychology that goes along with particular branches. And when they said there's a certain type of person that legislates well, and that type of person is probably not going to be as good of an executive. And an executive is not going to be as good of a legislator, but it's because the executive mentality, and you mentioned the Federalist Papers and James Madison, Federalist 70 says the executive power is defined by energy. And that energy, as I was saying earlier, is being decisive, being quick, being active. And that is not conducive. The kind of person that fills that, checks off those boxes, is not going to be the kind of person that is going to sit back and be timid and not assertive and not take basically all the power that's probably given to them. And so it's not a strange thing that they've been very assertive in this way. And also, I would add that, keeping the country safe is a pretty fundamental claim that they usually assert when they do what they do, whether that's true in the particular case or not. And so when people don't feel safe, they want assertive, decisive people acting for their safety. So it's a very attractive, at least talking point for presidents to make as well against Congress.
Yeah. Adam, we're going to go to the break. When we come back, I want to talk about how this applies to the situations that we're seeing in Venezuela and potentially in Greenland. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website, lighthousetv.org, for more information. Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Adam, thanks again for joining us. And let's transition now from War Powers Act to its application to what we've been seeing on the news lately. The president's action, President Trump's actions in Venezuela. And then he has these proposed actions with Greenland that obviously we haven't seen happen yet. But with Venezuela, so in the fall of 2025, the United States started bombing some ships coming out of Venezuela, official ships, fishermen ships, boats that they allege were bringing drugs, illegal drugs, and illegal immigrants into the United States. Obviously, we saw the president's deportations in 2025. A lot of those people were from Venezuela. And so the United States had hit some of these boats, and then very recently there actually was an operation to go into Venezuela and to kidnap and remove President Maduro. This is what's triggered the current conversations about the War Powers Act. Let me start 30,000 foot level. Is this the kind of situation where the War Powers Act would apply?
And that's a great question. And it brings up that in international affairs, there is law enforcement and there is military action. And that's where, with immigration as well, where there's been debate about to what degree should civil agents versus military be carrying those things out. I think we're in a similar situation here where clearly, if there was the commitment of, a commitment of troops on the ground, that would, I think, be a pretty clear instance. And I think the using of military operations to take a head of state really does call into question, has this crossed the line from previous actions, which I think might be more defensible as police or enforcement of anti-drug laws, enforcement of immigration laws, to something that when you start to take heads of state, when you start to send the military in to do so, I think you really are starting to get into ground where Congress was imagined to be involved and to have some say in what was being done. And that act was one of the ways that where Congress was trying to make that happen.
So Secretary Rubio's response to this was that this was a police action and the military was on the ground, but they were not on the ground for the removal of Maduro. They were on the ground to protect the police forces that were removing him. Is this semantics, or does the secretary have a point here?
I see where he's coming from as to what are the resources that are capable of being used for protection, but it seems that this is an instance where the real power is the military power as opposed to the police power. And again, I think that we need to have a better conversation about where those lines can be drawn, because I think that means that you could justify all sorts of actions by having both the law enforcement element and the military element at any particular point, and pick and choose which one you say is actually in charge based on what's preferential or what's best for your plans and purposes. So without a fuller defense than has been given, I find that kind of reasoning pretty suspect as far as the legal. And again, this is apart from whether you think this was a good action, a bad action, the right action or not. But that kind of legal justification, I think, is making fuzzy lines that I think need to be kept clear.
Right. Yeah, and to your point, this is a whole different conversation than whether Maduro was good, which he was not, and what should happen to him. This is kind of the question of how do we do it. One of the things that did not come up this time, but it's come up before in circles in D.C., is what if there's not a use of troops, but with our technology now, we can use drone strikes, military-directed drone strikes, or even there's an Air Force strike, air strikes where the troops their boots don't touch the ground. Does that exempt them from the War Powers Act? Or again, is this just politicians playing semantics, trying to find a loophole?
And to show that we're bipartisan in talking about this,
yes,
one of those situations was Libya with President Obama, where he refused, after making strikes, to send even a report to Congress under the War Powers Act, because he said, well, we didn't commit troops.
Right.
The troops were over top of the situation. They were not in the situation. And it probably the real answer to this is a clarification, meaning a further amendment to the act to specify that with the change in military tactics, the change in capacity, that what this includes for mere bombing campaigns or even the use of technology that doesn't even involve humans going over top of it. I would say that strains the spirit of the act at best. But technically, part of the problem is that this technology that's now being used to make that, that's being appealed to, just didn't exist when these acts came about. So I think the clearest thing to do is have a clarification, but certainly it's asking to do more and more militaristic things unilaterally, and I think playing at times against what the ultimate spirit was, which was when we commit our armed forces to military action, the default should be that Congress is involved in that decision.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to me that John F. Kennedy during Cuban Missile Crisis refused to call the blockade of Cuba a blockade, right? He calls it a quarantine. He's so careful about not using military terms to not kind of cross this line. And we weren't firing. I mean, they weren't even firing blanks on these boats coming in. And yet it seems like 60 years later, we kind of just throw caution to the wind. Is there a shift in how presidents have viewed this?
I think that there's a shift in maybe boldness in asserting these kind of powers. And I think that some of this is a bit of a less careful understanding of the separation of powers. And but I also think it's two other things. One is the world is much less clear than it used to be as far as what are nation states, what are legitimate and illegitimate regimes. The war on terror and terrorist cells has made that fuzzier beyond its own purview. And the other is, I think, because of Congress's decreasing power and increasingly looking to the presidency as a sort of unilateral actor, more generally speaking, and presidents feeling that they have a mandate from the people to act in more unilateral ways, domestically, yes, but especially militarily. So I think this is in many ways a symptom of those underlying changes in geopolitics and the breakdowns and categorizations of the kind of entities we interact with, but also internally the rise of more looking at the presidency as a kind of unified leader of the people and of the government, as opposed to our more separated power system.
I appreciate that nuance. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up our friends in Greenland. The president hasn't taken military action there yet. He's talked about purchasing it. That's another conversation for another day. But it was floated a few times that if Denmark will not sell, the United States will take Greenland by whatever means necessary, depending obviously on what action that would be. A lot of people are saying that would be in clear violation of the president's constitutional rights and limits and the War Powers Act. How do you read that situation as a hypothetical right now?
Yeah, I think a unilateral action of that type would be even more clearly beyond the pale. At least in Venezuela, you could argue there are laws about drug trafficking, human trafficking. There's laws about immigration, and that there was at least some attempt to get at those root causes. Here, you would really need to appeal to some kind of self-defense, but if the self-defense, and this would also be looking at UN charters and things like that, if the self-defense was, if we don't have Greenland, then other major powers could control it and be a threat to us, is a kind of self-defense that, and the Trump administration and Trump himself would really bristle at this, that looks a little bit more like the policy of George W. Bush in its preemption, defense by preemption. I know he would not like that. He would not agree with that. And I think that an action of that kind, though, if it was treated as self-defense, if it was justified as self-defense, would look more like those very hawkish, very active and even intrusionary foreign policies that the president himself campaigned on bringing to an end and going in a different direction.
Yeah. Last question, real quick. Do you think the War Powers Act is a necessary thing to have?
I think that it is probably a less effective tool and should not be leaned on as much as other things. The ultimate way that the Vietnam War was ended, for example, was not through things like the War Powers Resolution. It was the Congress's power of the purse. Congress has the power to allocate money, to withdraw money, to designate money. And in the end, I think that constitutional power is much more authoritative. It's much more effective if Congress is willing to use it. I think some of these definitions can be of some help, but ultimately the Congress's power to stop executive action beyond things like impeachment, the regular way is to say we will not give money for this, and therefore you do not have the resources to do it.
Wow. That's a great word. Thank you, Adam. We're going to go to the break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Adam, thank you again for joining us and for sharing your insights on this. As we close out, I understand you have a new book on the market called That Blessed Liberty. Tell us about the book.
Yeah, so this is not connected to what we were saying, but I really, as part of my research to get to these kind of questions that we're talking about, is to ask origins. How did we develop to this place? And religion and the American Republic is an important topic, whether you're religious or not, to understand. And so a former colleague of mine, still a very good friend of mine, Miles Smith from Hillsdale College, a historian, we teamed up to do a book, and here's the cover. And what it tracks is the biographies of American bishops in the Protestant Episcopal Church, and how they helped form that important church within American history up to the Civil War. But it also has stories about the broader American experience. A lot of these men were part of settling the West, establishing universities and educational institutions. One of them, from the state I live in now, was even sent at one point on a semi-secret mission by Abraham Lincoln and others in the Lincoln administration over to England to try to keep England from recognizing the South during the American Civil War. So while it has a particular religious focus, it also is the story about how those men and that institution was part of this broader development of the American Republic as well.
That's awesome. Congratulations on the book. Where can people find it?
One can find it. The best way to go is on Amazon, but really most other major booksellers, you should be able to find it as well. It's through Pro Lego Press, and reasonably priced, I should say, as if I'm going to be a sales pitchman. But hope it might be of help to some who want to learn a little more about that history.
That Blessed Liberty. Adam, congratulations, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
That is our show for this evening. I want to thank Dr. Adam Carrington for joining us, and of course, thanks to each of you for tuning in as well. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.